masks on in this time. I wanted, though, to do what we started doing in the fall, the thumbs up, thumbs down, about people's comfort level with the speakers taking off their masks when they are speaking. This is at the count of 3, thumb up or thumb down. If anybody does not feel safe with it, and this is so we're not staring at each other, and has a thumb down, the speakers will keep their masks on because we want everybody to feel safe. So count of 3, 1, 2, 3. All right. Thank you. But I'll put it back on when I'm done. It's so wonderful to have you all here tonight at the Athenaeum of Philadelphia, members and friends and guests and visitors. We are a very special place, full of people who love to be engaged, who are intellectually curious and insatiable for learning. And it's a very unique place for us here at the Athenaeum. And we're glad for those of you who braved the cold and all the many anxieties and uncertainties that this seemingly never-ending pandemic is causing in all of us. So thank you for being here tonight. If this is your first time, pre-pandemic, we would have had a crowd here tonight, and you would have had experienced what it feels like to be in the midst of a very diverse group of people who want to engage together and talk and learn and hear different viewpoints and come away thinking about the world a little bit differently. So even though we are a small group, I believe we're still going to be able to do that, and our speaker tonight is looking forward at the end of our conversation to lots of questions and answers with all of you. And I hope if you find that you enjoy what you experienced tonight, you will continue to come back for more programs that we have and continue to be a part of this community. So welcome. I want to let you know that afterwards, our guest speaker will be at the back signing books, and Carly with Head House Books is selling copies. So you may buy a copy and get it signed for yourself, for a friend. I know Christmas passed and Hanukkah and all of that, but there's going to be some occasion, somebody who is depressed about the winter and maybe wants to learn a little bit something about the world beyond us, and you can give this to them as a gift. So welcome to the Athenaeum. Tonight's special guest, Gordon Fraser, graciously agreed to come and speak here on his way to the Modern Language Association Conference in Washington, D.C. He's giving a paper there tomorrow, so thank you, Gordon, for coming and spending your time with us this evening. Dr. Fraser is a lecturer and presidential fellow in American Studies at the University of Manchester in England, although he holds his advanced degrees from the University of Connecticut and was a visiting fellow at Penn State during the 2018-2019 academic year. He shared with me that he arrived at Manchester just in time for the pandemic to hit, and now he's getting used to carrying an umbrella with him wherever he goes. Not bad as compared to having your ice scraper with you all the time. His work focuses on 19th-century print culture and the history of science, and I am excited, and I hope all of you are excited to hear his talk today about the ways that the United States and other peoples who live within this country have used mapping and the stars to assert identity as well as power. And so I ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Gordon Fraser to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, all of you, for coming out in the middle of a pandemic to hear this talk. I really appreciate that. I am going to talk today about my book, Star Territory, which just came out over the summer. But I would like to start by telling a story. So the story begins with John Adams in the month that he was going to be sworn in as the first vice president of the United States. And that month, he expected to see a comet. In fact, Adams helped to pay for a publication announcing this celestial appearance. And he regarded it, I think, as this auspicious astronomical event in the new nation. So since the classical era, comets had been imagined as ill omens for rulers. Plutarch linked the appearance of a comet to the death of Julius Caesar, for instance, and Shakespeare repeats that association in his play about Caesar's assassination. But while the traditional link between the appearance of comets and the deaths of kings hadn't changed by the late 18th century, the ultimate meaning of that association, I think, had changed entirely. If comets augured the deaths of kings, perhaps they equally augured the lives of republics. Perhaps this young revolutionary nation, which had just thrown off a king, might benefit from the appearance of a comet during the inauguration of its first president and vice president. There was only one problem with this comet. It never appeared. Adams likely learned about the comet that never was from a series of newspaper advertisements that appeared in Massachusetts in 1788 and 1789. An astronomer and war veteran named Bartholomew Burgess was hoping to publish a cometary prediction. He contacted Adams about this, hoping to publish this cometary prediction accompanied by a fold-out chart that was probably the first accurate-to-scale diagram of a comet to appear in North America. And you can see the engraved plate that was published with this book right here. So, with Adams's assistance, Burgess found backers to fund 2 editions of the book, and in it he predicted that on the 27th of April, 1789, the comet would appear. And you can actually see the orbit in the slide. So it's that elliptical orbit, and he writes the date in the orbit. I'm not sure if you can make it out there. So, like I said before, this comet that was predicted at the beginning of the Adams administration, it never appeared. And today, astronomers know what happened. Sometime in the 17th or 18th century, this mass of ice and rock broke apart. And so while it continued on its orbit, no 18th century astronomer would have been able to see it. But it's still out there. It was last seen by astronomers with more powerful telescopes in 2002. But finding it was absolutely beyond the abilities of an 18th century astronomer, and the actual cosmos, these 18th century astronomers came to realize, is not nearly as predictable a metaphor as nationalists might hope. Things got worse for Burgess after that. His business partners pocketed the money from the sale of the book, and he took on debt to publish a series of maps, which also didn't make him very much money. And in 1790, he was broke and reaching out again to Adams for financial support. Burgess's comet, though, is revealing of 18th century star science. And I think it's also revealing of the informal role that astronomy played in U.S. politics. For nationalists such as Adams, the new nation was exceptional in a cosmic sense. Celestial language was ubiquitous among the early leaders, and I'm just going to give you a few examples. So most obviously, boosters described the United States as having emerged from a revolution, which is an astronomical metaphor connoting a return to older orders. This isn't really apt for the United States, which wasn't so much reproducing an older order as producing a new one, but the revolution metaphor stuck. And astronomical metaphors didn't stop there. From 1777 onward, the Continental Congress described the 13 United States as a, quote, new constellation in the firmament of nations, and appropriately, the national flag was covered in stars. To Thomas Paine, the new nation would be a, quote, primary planet. To the Navy Administrator, Francis Hopkinson, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, it would be a, quote, new planet in the system called the American Empire, unquote. And this comes from a wonderful letter from Hopkinson to Thomas Jefferson, where he is describing an 18th century theory of planet formation, and he argues that it's the same as national formation in the United States. So he's like, when the molten magma starts to spin, it's like when we had a battle at Concord and Lexington. It was a very strange letter if you ever get a chance to see it. The nation's first chief executive, he was described widely as a polar star, this kind of guide by which a sovereign people could navigate. The authority of the new federal government would travel in a wide orbit, according to Alexander Hamilton, who's the star of a major musical. And the nation's warships bore names like USS Constellation. Its coins bore inscriptions like Nova Constellatio or New Constellation. So the aspirations of many 18th century people were nationalistic and astronomically organized. So in my talk today, I'm going to go back to the beginning of the story I try to tell in Star Territory, and I'm going to make 3 suggestions. First, I'm going to suggest that early leaders tried to fashion a new American republic, this new American republic, into a space power. Today, the phrase space power is used by theorists of military strategy to describe the constellation of advantages that accrue to nation-states with the technological ability to map, predict, and exploit forces and bodies in space. Applied to the early republic, the phrase is an anachronism, but I think it's a useful one. Military theorists have concluded, in essence, that space power enables nation-states to project influence through demonstrations of scientific prestige, to economically reward other global actors for their cooperation, often through shared commercial advantages, and to project force. Of course, American space power looked different in the period before rockets, satellites, and ballistic missiles. But much of this cosmic language and astronomical printing, I'm going to suggest, was part of a concerted effort to make outer space part of the early nationalist project. Second, I'm going to suggest that this effort largely failed, at least initially. It was thwarted by economic realities, by limits on human knowledge, that comet that doesn't appear, and I'm going to add by racial tensions woven into the fabric of American society. And yet attempts to fashion a kind of American astronomical empire had, by the end of the 19th century, succeeded. By 1852, the United States had become a nation-state with a sophisticated space mapping operation called the American Ephemeris. By 1900, it had astronomical outposts and observatories around the world and complex systems for training soldiers, sailors, and even insurance agents in astronomical prediction. And third, I am going to suggest that the creation of the United States as a space power, a kind of astronomical empire, has consequences for how we think about the next space age, which is now beginning. We are, I argue, on the verge of a new neo-colonialist age of space. NASA administrators advocate public-private partnerships for the development of space commerce, and the United States military, especially since the 2019 establishment of the U.S. Space Force, seeks unilateral control of strategic regions above the atmosphere. In Star Territory, I suggest that U.S. efforts to exploit the cosmos have a deep 18th and 19th century history, and that confronting our present position depends on knowing that history. So in order to tell that history, I want to back up to the beginning of my story. What did outer space mean to people in the early republic? The best way to think about that question, I think, is with those literary texts explaining outer space, or that explained outer space, to ordinary people in the 18th century, or the late 18th century. Now, I started with a book about a comet, but books like that were pretty rare. Almanacs were much more common. In fact, almanacs were the literary text most widely available to readers in British North America and the United States in the late 18th century. So this is a chart showing the total number of novel imprints in the 1790s. If a Philadelphia publisher prints 500 copies of the first edition of a novel, that's one imprint. If those sell out, and he prints a second edition, that's 2 imprints. So I want to compare this now to almanacs. In a given year, there were between 3 and 8 times as many imprints of almanacs as there were of novels. But even this understates the case. The largest London publishers in the 1790s would print no more than 750 copies of a novel in an individual edition. Almanacs, by contrast, were printed in the thousands. The Boston printer Ezekiel Russell would advertise that his almanacs were for sale, quote, by the thousand, gross, hundred, dozen, or single, unquote. Benjamin Franklin printed Poor Richard's Almanac in batches of 10,000 at a time back in the 1740s. Almanacs were everywhere. Even more importantly, these texts shaped the everyday cosmologies of readers. In essence, almanacs provided a vernacular way of knowing the relations between individuals and communities and geographies and temporalities. Readers interacted with almanacs, signing them and writing in their pages. The New Hampshire minister, Amariah Frost, Jr., for instance, kept notes in his copy of Bickerstaff's New England Almanac for 1787. The almanac maker had predicted that beginning August 15th, readers would experience pleasant weather for some time. Frost, or perhaps somebody else, corrected the almanac by inscribing 2 X marks between August 15th and August 20th, and noting that instead of pleasant weather, there were terrible hurricanes during that period. As a consequence of this decision to record the weather, Frost's almanac now provides a local scale record of meteorological history. And indeed, many readers would save their almanacs year to year in order to keep hold of that history. Other readers would purchase their almanacs interleaved with blank pages, and they would use them to keep diaries and records of family life. So this is a page from Christopher Columbus Baldwin's copy of the New England Farmer's Almanac, in which he recorded the death of his mother. On the page for April, he writes this: 24. On Friday morning, 20 minutes before dawn, she dies without a struggle. For the next day, he writes, the remains of my mother are deposited in the family tomb. Her maiden name was Abigail Wareforce, born at New Braintree, 16th of June, 1768. On the opposite page, under the heading Memorable Days, the almanac notes, 25, Oliver Cromwell, born 1599. Through the almanac diary, Baldwin mapped his mother's life and death onto public history, and he also mapped his own life onto the natural world. At the bottom of the page, under an entry for April 30th, he writes, the month has been unusually cold. Old men say there has been nothing like it since 1794. This copy of the New England Farmer's Almanac was, at least ostensibly, printed to provide a record of the public past. Oliver Cromwell was born in 1599. Interleaved with Baldwin's diary, however, it provides a record of life and death and space and time and nature as experienced at human scale. Baldwin, along with numerous others, located himself through print and script in geographic space, in time, and in the natural world. For agents of the nascent federal state, almanacs represented a problem of scale. By orders of magnitude, almanacs were the most popular and widely reproduced kind of text available to readers. But their content was at once individuated in providing space through which people could record their lives, local in describing regional geography, tides, and the weather, and universal in describing the celestial operations of the universe itself. They were not national. The cosmos, in short, had very little to do with the nation-state. Yet early nationalists regarded the cosmos as part of the U.S. project. The United States was going to be a new constellation after all, and astronomer Andrew Ellicott, among others, saw in the almanac an opportunity to shape how people in the United States understood the nation in relation to the cosmos. The Washington administration had hired Ellicott to complete a survey of the new District of Columbia, where the new federal capital was going to be. And in a letter to Thomas Jefferson, Ellicott insisted that these calculations would be insufficient unless they were consistently transmitted through print to settler colonials, military officers, and even to merchants. He writes this: "It would be very well, when the city of Washington is more accurately settled by a sufficient course of observations, to have an American gazetteer published in which the longitudes should be reckoned east and west from the capital," unquote. By controlling the dissemination of astronomical information, Ellicott hoped, the state would control the single most important text by which people came to position themselves in time, geography, and social life. His dream would not be realized in his lifetime, but he did pay from his own money to print a sample almanac on which the project could be based, calculated for the national capital. And lest there be any doubt about Ellicott's ambitions, the title page reveals his hope that the federal state might rationalize or even govern the cosmos. The almanac's title in full reads this way: "The New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia Almanac and Ephemeris for the year of our Lord 1793, being the first after the leap year, the 17th of American independence, and the 5th year of our federal government, which may be the governor of the world proper." I love the grammatical slippage. Is the new federal government the governor of the world proper, or is this almanac? It hardly matters. By describing the federal government as continuous with the world proper, and by mapping the cosmic center of the universe onto the political center of U.S. power, Ellicott attempted to bring the state and the cosmos together into a single rationalized artifact of print production. Washington provided a cosmic and political starting point from which readers could make calculations of space, time, or even politics. Ellicott's almanac suggests, moreover, that calculations, or perhaps the state that enables such calculations, will be the governor of the world, of the entire world. So Ellicott was called away on another assignment, and his astronomical findings were largely lost. But his self-taught assistant would go on to produce the most widely reprinted and accurate almanac of the mid-1790s. That man's name was Benjamin Banneker, and this is his portrait. So today, Banneker is a famous figure in Black intellectual history, a self-taught astronomer born free in Maryland and the producer of some of the most accurate celestial predictions of the 18th century. One study of 18th century almanacs found that Banneker's calculations were more accurate even than those of Ellicott's, who had been described at the time by one university president as a better qualified astronomer than anybody upon the continent. But when Banneker is discussed in this context, what I've just described as this figure in Black intellectual history, when he's discussed in this context, he's often presented as a figure opposed to the U.S. state, a Black intellectual whose exceptional ability and fundamental dignity reveals the preposterousness of an emerging science of biological race. This story's accurate. But today, I want to focus on why Banneker came to be seen as a figure undermining astronomical authority, or the authority of the U.S. state. After all, Banneker was also an employee of the federal government. He helped to map the boundaries of Washington, D.C., and when news of Banneker's mathematical ability began to spread, then Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson would initially voice support. He famously replied to a letter from Banneker saying that praising Banneker's mathematical abilities. That letter was then reprinted without Jefferson's permission. And privately, Jefferson wrote to the Marquis de Condorcet, writing that, quote, "I procured Banneker to be employed under one of our chief directors in laying out the new federal city." I want to pause here. His language, "I procured Banneker to lay out the federal city," this is true only in the most technical sense. He had never heard of Banneker. He was officially responsible for overseeing Ellicott, and Ellicott hired Banneker. So Jefferson is playing a little fast and loose with the truth here. So Jefferson regarded Banneker as a federal employee. at least at first, and at least when trying to cultivate foreign intellectuals skeptical of slavery. Even more importantly, Banneker's almanacs were popular, incredibly so. His 1794 edition might have been the most widely reprinted set of almanac calculations in the United States that year, and his almanacs were certainly reprinted in Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, and New Hampshire. By 1796, at the latest, Banneker's name was known in South Carolina. By 1799, news of Banneker had traveled as far as Hamburg, Germany. One can imagine a counterfactual history in which Benjamin Banneker became not a symbol of black intellectualism, but of early U.S. nationalism, a federal government surveyor who produces accurate and popular commercial almanacs enabling farming, traveling, and timekeeping throughout the Republic, and importantly, in the center of the Republic at Washington, D.C. But that's not what happened. Jefferson was attacked for his initial praise of Banneker, with South Carolina Congressman William Loughton Smith writing this, quote, "What shall we think of a Secretary of State thus fraternizing with Negroes, writing them complimentary epistles, styling them his black brethren, and congratulating them on evidences of their genius, and assuring them of his good wishes for their speedy emancipation," unquote. While today we regard Jefferson as a racial conservative, in his own political context, he wasn't nearly conservative enough for some of his fellow enslavers. And Banneker himself was barred from sharing with readers his own writing, including a poem that he wrote, because his manumissionist printers believed they could make the anti-slavery case better than Banneker could. In order to be useful to the national project, an almanac would have to be accurate and mapped on to the political center of U.S. power. This is what Ellicott envisioned. Banneker, throughout the 1790s, was the only person producing calculations that matched that description. His almanacs would have allowed a reader to set her or his clock in the Washington area, and his almanacs were accurate. And yet he became a symbol not of national cohesion, but of national confusion. And in any case, centralized almanac production ceased. Ellicott published his last almanac in 1792. Banneker published his last almanac in 1796. By 1802, now President Thomas Jefferson was living in the capital city without access to basic astronomical information. The Ellicott survey had established a national prime meridian, but no one printed where it was by this point, and it didn't come into widespread use. Jefferson observed of the new city, quote, "There is no such thing as a meridian or any other means of keeping our clocks and watches right in this place," unquote. Without recourse to almanacs, a basic commercial product available elsewhere in the United States, the capital city's clocks could not be properly set, and it was quite literally a city out of time. For nearly the first half of the 19th century, the U.S. state repeatedly tried and failed to regulate almanac and star chart production. In December 1823, President James Monroe transmitted a report to the United States Senate warning that the, quote, permanent security, his words, permanent security of the United States depended upon the calculations of foreign powers. And then something changed. Beginning in 1852, the United States Navy began to publish the American Ephemeris, a book-length set of mathematical predictions about the future observable locations of bodies in the solar system. A book about outer space has wonderful pictures in it. This is not one of the wonderful pictures. I really wish I could share with you how exciting this is, but it really is just a table of numbers. But it's an amazing table of numbers because it's a table that predicts where bodies in outer space are going to be located in current years, down to the day, down to the minute. A way to think about it might be our global positioning system, which also maps, in this case, longitude, latitude, altitude, speed, and time. But this didn't do altitude or speed, but it basically maps the bodies, future locations of bodies in outer space. So with this book, a navigator or military commander could chart more precisely than ever before the location of a ship at sea or a military unit on land. And in fact, the ephemeris is probably best compared to our contemporary military tools that depend on precision, like GPS, which I just mentioned. The American ephemeris is important, moreover, because it helped the United States to win the Civil War. Launched less than a decade after the war broke out, a decade before the war broke out, the ephemeris would prove invaluable to warfighters. And during research for Star Territory, I went to the National Archives and I looked at records for the American Ephemeris Office. And most of the wartime records have been lost. But those that remain reveal that hundreds of these almanacs were shipped regularly, weekly, sometimes daily, to far-flung ports and military outposts. They were a critical tool for warfighters. After the war, in fact, a writer for the North American Review observed that when the United States had been forced to rely on British calculations, quote, "It was as if our Navy had been armed with foreign ordnance or ammunition or other supplies." Previously, U.S. naval commanders could be mistaken about their position at sea by as much as 10 miles. The American ephemeris offered greater precision in navigation and, through precision, advantage. And what you're seeing here, what you're looking at, is a letter from the navigation officer at the Boston Navy Yard requesting that almanacs be shipped. And so these letters came in daily or weekly. I wish I had better numbers, but many of the periods have been lost, and so I only have these little snippets of when we have these orders coming in. Moreover, the publication of the American ephemeris was merely one step in the emergence of the United States as a 19th century space power. The confusion that characterized early efforts that I was talking about earlier, that confusion had, by the middle of the 19th century, given way to a well-funded campaign to fund astronomy. Between 1838 and 1901, the U.S. government sponsored no fewer than 16 astronomical expeditions. They sent astronomers to Chile, Tasmania, Sumatra, and elsewhere. By 1908, the Naval Observatory had published more than 350 books describing celestial motion or providing guidance to navigators. And according to one historian, the 19th century U.S. government and private philanthropists in the United States spent as much in inflation-adjusted dollars on measuring stars, planets, and asteroids as NASA currently spends on robotic interplanetary missions. And this investment impressed other 19th century powers. This image was drawn by a British caricaturist in 1874. And it depicts a group of British military astronomers who are on an expedition to Hawaii, but they stop in Washington, D.C. And they're encountering for the first time the new Naval Observatory telescope, which was then the largest telescope in the world. They expected to see a Washington infant, which is written at the top in script, a small telescope from a minor astronomical power. But then they doff their hats when they see the U.S. device, and the caricaturist writes, "We were nearly fainting with astonishment." By the late 19th century, the United States had become, I think, a space power. But the question I've had to ask myself in writing Star Territory is this: are there any alternatives to this instrumental relation to the cosmos? The U.S. state has long pursued narrow efforts to map and exploit the universe, but have people within the United States developed other ways of thinking about our relation to outer space? And the answer is yes. There were numerous people who dissented from the instrumentalized cosmos in the 19th century, and it's to these dissenters that I turn for insight in the book. From the first black publishers in the United States to the editors of the Cherokee Phoenix, which is the Cherokee newspaper, to the last reigning monarch of the Kingdom of Hawaii, political actors across the 19th century imagined and communicated other ways of relating to the universe. And I'll just show you a few very quick examples here. So this is the first Cherokee newspaper, which was edited by Elias Boudinot. This is funded by the Cherokee Nation itself. And what I found fascinating about this newspaper when I first started flipping through it is it had so much information about recent discoveries in astronomy mixed with observations like these. The newspaper asked, why should we think our Earth the only planet in our system that is peopled? It also asks, astronomers suppose that the fixed stars are other systems of planets are to other systems of planets what our sun is to this. It's noteworthy, then, that the first government in North America to authorize the creation of a national almanac was the Cherokee government. In 1836, this is a later edition, but in 1836 they authorized the production of the first national almanac in North America, and it's the Cherokee National Almanac. The black newspaper editors Samuel Cornish and John Russwurm, who published the first black newspaper in the United States, Freedom's Journal, they included numerous examples of studies about star science, about comets, about astronomy, and questions about whether or not astronomical knowledge confers on us ethical obligation. If we know, for instance, that there were life on other worlds, what would our ethical obligation be to that life and to each other, knowing that? And Liliuokalani, the last monarch of the Kingdom of Hawaii, she was deposed in 1893. She privately published an account of the creation and development of the universe, giving this printed book as a gift to at least one university, to the Library of Congress, to a scholarly society, and to numerous friends and allies. These dissenters from the instrumentalism of the United States asked all kinds of questions that we don't often expect to hear in the archives or to see in the archives of the 19th century. What is our ethical obligation to potential life on other worlds? What might it mean to colonize spaces such as the moon, which have for millennia been treated as sacred by human beings? And what might thinking about the universe as a site of sacred potential life tell us about how we treat our fellow human beings, animals, and the ecology of the earth itself? Throughout the 19th century, political actors from within and beyond the United States imagined ways of understanding and relating to the universe that were not merely instrumental, not merely a means of projecting space power. So it's not my goal to romanticize the unconsolidated field of late 18th and early 19th century astronomical knowledge production. Pre-20th century star science can be pretty idiosyncratic, with its faulty comet predictions and its weather reports from the future. But instead, I'm suggesting that understanding the legacy of this earlier unconsolidated period might enable us to see the present more clearly. We inhabit a form of space and time that is highly regulated, even militarized, and it's becoming more so. Outer space will increasingly become a site of geopolitical conflict, one that I think will, in troubling ways, resemble the 19th century scramble for territory here on Earth. Private companies will shortly start trying to mine asteroids. Utopian billionaires will shortly begin trying to send people to Mars. In light of this return to a more contested scramble for territory, I think it's best that we remember not only how the 19th century provided an early case study for space power politics, but also how dissenters from an instrumentalized relation to the cosmos show us other ways of relating to the universe that we might hold in common. Long before the Gemini or Apollo missions, long before the creation of the Global Positioning System or GPS, agents of the United States government sought to map and measure the universe as a means of controlling strategic territory in North America and around the world. But others in the 19th century imagined very different ways of understanding and relating to the cosmos. These dissenting astronomers, scholars, poets, prophets, and printers communicated their own accounts of the universe. Recalling their dissent, I suggest, is more urgent now than ever. As agents of world governments and private investors embark on the work of a third space age, promoting commerce and defending that commerce through the projection of force, we would do well to recall that there are different ways of understanding, interacting with, and inhabiting the universe. America's first long space age, its 19th century space age, was an era of expansion and exploitation, but it was not only that. In the 21st century, we would do well to recall how some in the 19th regarded the universe as wonderful, mysterious, and sacred. Thanks. So if you have questions, I can answer those, including questions about 19th century space aliens, which are always my favorite questions to answer, but really any questions.
What was the time back in the 18th century? Was there a time between astronomy and astrology? Is there any connection there that you could speak to?
Sure. Well, I think an enormous amount of information about astrology in the almanacs, these kind of privately printed almanacs, and so, which is why I think the almanacs are so interesting, because they're this mashup of information. So you would get in an almanac, you would get predictions of sunrises and sunsets and tides for the next year, but you would also get, in many cases, astrological predictions about your future based on astrology. You'd also get medicine recipes, distances for travel. You could sometimes have diary information. And so what you really had was this catch-all book. Like, if you only bought one book this year, you should buy an almanac because it has everything. It seems to me that the more that information became rationalized by the state, and not just the United States, also in Britain and in France and other places, the more it became rationalized, the more astrology filtered out. And it just became, here's the sunrise, the sunset, the tides, here's how you set your clock. And the astrological information was really local and idiosyncratic, and commercial. Yeah. I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah.
I'm curious what you make of like the resurgence of popular astrology, particularly with I think it's pretty like college age young women
Mm-hmm.
in general, sort of like game astrology, like apps and things that they've done, looking to the planets,
Mm-hmm.
don't have here.
Yeah.
Wonder if you see that as like a percent, like type of people who are engaging in this kind of activity, and the way in which they do so kind of has that effect to it in
Yeah.
some way, or if it's if you think it in another way, it's sort of a recolonization of the planet's space itself. That is kind of exemplified by that wish to know
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
to map out
Yeah.
what is happening above. I'm just curious
Yeah.
what your thoughts are on this kind of resurgence.
I think that's a fascinating question. I actually think it's the first one. So, because I get how you could say, well, this is a recolonization of the planet. It's projecting onto the stars what I want. But I think what's so interesting about horoscopes and astrology is that they place you, the reader, at the center of the universe, right? All of the forces of the universe are conspiring at the single point, which is your consciousness and your interest in what happens next. And the thing about instrumentalizing the universe is that it gives you actionable information, right? So the instrumentalizing state says, I'm not interested in my own psyche, my own consciousness, my relationships with other people. I'm not interested in that. I want to make sure that when I launch a missile, it lands. Or when I send a warship out to sea, it always knows where it is so that it can join with other warships and attack. And so astrology, and you mentioned the audience for astrology being in particular young women, I think what's interesting about astrology is that it's about storytelling and relationships. And it doesn't have to be young women who are interested in it. It can be anyone, but it can be only people who are fundamentally interested in how the cosmos makes meaning for their lives and relationships, and not how the cosmos enables me to do particular work or take particular action to exploit some natural resource. It's kind of non-actionable. I found a website that does horoscopes that are incredibly falsifiable, which I love. It's like, tomorrow you will inherit a great deal of money. And then I'm like waiting all day and I don't. But what it speaks to though is that desire to understand my own life in the universe and to like think about myself in relation to the universe. So, yeah. Cool, thanks.
I think there's always been, especially in the last several centuries, different tracks. There are those who are studying the stars because of that pure intellect curiosity, like the transit of
Mm-hmm.
David Rick.
Yeah.
They weren't out, that was an international collaboration.
Yeah.
There was no politicalization. It was for that noise.
Mm-hmm.
But then you get a separate track where you get gradually, especially with land grabbing,
Right.
this idea that it sense of colonization, so that you have a political track.
Right. Yeah.
That mapping, map something means you've got control over. You have marked, you have put it in space, you have located.
Yeah.
It's just, but I think there must still, I hope, more than just billionaires with rockets
Yeah.
that are really just, yeah, there.
Well, and I think it's a dynamic tension. So I've forgotten his name because of course I have. But the second director of the U.S. Coast Survey was that way, pure, as much a pure scientist as someone can be, and purely interested in the science of. No, he was the firstborn one. Oh, is he really? Oh wow. Okay. Yeah, and Rittenhouse Square is just down the street, so this is an astronomy place. Oh gosh, yeah. I quoted in the talk. This is a little bit of an aside, but I quoted in the talk how Andrew Ellicott was described as the best astronomer on the continent, which I always thought was a real dig at David Rittenhouse because he was, a contemporary and also on the continent, and they knew each other. And there weren't that many astronomers, so it's like a very particular dig at him. But anyway, so this director of the Coast Survey, who's really purely interested in science, he is approached by a U.S. senator who says, when will this mapping project, the scientific mapping project, be done? When will you finish? And he says, when will you stop annexing territory? Because he was this emotionally anti-imperialist person, but the science was being funded by the U.S. state, and that's where the science was being done, and he was interested in promoting that science. And so you're always having that kind of dynamic tension, I think, between scientists and state actors who aren't necessarily interested in the science for pure knowledge. Yeah. Yes?
Being a woman involved in the field, Mariah Mitchell,
Yes. I didn't talk about her at all today, but I talk about her a lot in the fourth chapter of the book. But yes, but
just that this, we went out to pluralist looking at her, she like 12 brothers, I think that one would be the science, through everybody, and then she was the youngest on the one, and she was just brilliant. Apparently some of the were so ahead of her time.
yeah.
There's now in Kentucky, there's a observatory.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so interesting because they fund interns in all different areas, like life in outer space,
Mm-hmm.
animal life possibly,
Yeah.
human life. But there's these things are studying things that I didn't realize that serious academically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Mitchell's extraordinary. So the Ephemeris I showed you, the American Ephemeris and Nautical Almanac. I'll just go back to it here. So this document, this tool for warfighters, it really can't be made by the Navy. And so what they do beginning in 1855 is they order the Navy administrator of the program to simply go out and find the best astronomers in the United States. And there aren't many at this time. And Mitchell, who had already established herself as a major American astronomer, she was the first American to independently discover a comet, and she toured Europe and met with other major astronomers, and she was conducting her own science. And so Mitchell is brought in, and given what is arguably the most important job in the Ephemeris. Her job is to predict the future position of Venus going forward over several years. And Venus, the morning and evening star, Venus is the one that navigators on ships use, perhaps not most frequently, they're also observing the moon, but they're using it very, very frequently. They're using Venus's position. And so Mitchell is in charge of that and does it for many years. What I find fascinating about her is that she is precise and professional and paid less than her male contemporaries, but delivers on deadline better when you look at the letters, so go figure. But also that she thought that this project was limited. She thought it was important, that it made ship travel safer, it had all kinds of benefits. But she thought that it was limited because it didn't move beyond mere prediction. It was just predicting. And so she felt that, she wrote an essay about the ideal astronomer. And she said the ideal astronomer would have the ability to do this kind of mathematical prediction. They would have precise mathematical ability. They would also be observational. They would know how to observe and actually work the equipment, which a lot of astronomers who spent time doing the math didn't have. And then the third point she made was that they had to think like poets, because the only way you could make real discoveries, she thought, is by first imagining possibilities that nobody had imagined before, and then testing them out and seeing if they're really there. And so I think Mitchell's interesting because when I look at her in relation to these fellow astronomers doing the same kind of work, she's the one who's talking about how limited this instrumental relation to the cosmos is. She's part of it. I think what we were talking about just a moment ago, that scientists are entangled in this geopolitical power project. She's part of it, but she's thinking beyond it in really fascinating ways. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Yes. Right. Maybe, I just want to make sure I understand the question. I lost the beginning of it. I'm sorry. Yeah. Right. Yeah, because if I think about, I mentioned that experience Jefferson has in 1802, where his method of telling time is to look at the almanac for what time will sunrise be and set his clock or his watch to sunrise. And that's a simple thing he can execute, but the almanacs are all wrong, and so it doesn't work. But I think you're right that, like, as the technology for measuring time becomes more sophisticated, first with more accurate and proliferating clocks and watches, and then with the telegraph, which allows people to coordinate time across distance. As that happens, the almanac becomes less and less important. It's not this thing that's the local almanac, the little almanac that every person has in their kitchen. That becomes less and less important to individual people. At the same time, the almanacs like this become much more important because they're used in coordination with other timekeeping systems. So my super accurate clock is then used in coordination with this book, which then allows me to map precisely my position and know precisely my time. And so really what you get is, I think what your question points to is centralization, that time becomes increasingly a function of what the state says it is, and less this kind of idiosyncratic relation to the universe that's of varying accuracy. Okay. Yes.
So I find it fascinating that folks like Elias Coutinho and Stanley Cornish were keeping up like other Americans with all of this new knowledge coming out about astronomy. But then they were trying to move the conversation forward, these alternative narratives,
Yeah.
asking these questions. Do you come across from your research any instances of the white powers that be ever responding back and making it a real dialogue, or was it always just on their side, on the African Americans or Native Americans, or did you find a response from the government? Do you think questions that were being asked?
Yeah. Not from the government, at least not in the cases I'm looking at specifically. What you do get are people like Henry David Thoreau or Emerson and white intellectuals who are engaged in this discourse. What you do find is that they're very much engaged with ideas that are either shared, like ideas from Europe that Russwurm and Cornish are promoting, and Emerson and Thoreau are promoting at the same time. Ideas about life on other worlds or our ethical obligation to the cosmos. Or you find them in some cases actually responding. Emerson reads copies of the Cherokee Phoenix, or the Cherokee Almanac, I'm sorry. But there is some back and forth there. But I think what's really fascinating and really unfortunate is that a lot of the materials I look at in those chapters about the first black publishers or about the Cherokee Nation or about the Hawaiian government, a lot of those materials aren't widely known at the time. And so a lot of them have only come about or only really become accessible to me because of generations of recent scholars who've recovered them and thought deeply about them and historicized them in various ways. And so, yeah, so a lot of that wasn't talked about in the 19th century more widely. Are we questioned out? I don't know what time it is, but thank you very much, everybody, for coming out.
Thank you, Gordon. I think this was just fascinating, and obviously there's so much more to dig into. You can buy his book in the back, as I said before, and Gordon will be right back at the table to sign copies. You want to get a copy and read the chapter on Mariah Mitchell, I think, definitely. And we hope that you will all come back. We have a full season for this winter, January, February, March. The brochures went out at the post office more than a week ago, and so we're hoping they get to you really soon. But in the meantime, you can look online to find we have a variety of things, both virtual and in person. More author talks, more virtual noon talks. We have our book clubs. We have courses coming up by historian Rick Bell, by art historian Larry Silver, and our archaeologist Renata Holod, which should be really fascinating. The Lost City of Ray with Dr. Holod, Rembrandt with Dr. Silver, and what the Founding Fathers were reading with Rick Bell. And those of you who've taken his classes, he's someone we kind of have on regular here to teach. We have film screenings. We have chamber music concerts. First Fridays, in a couple of weeks, we have a new exhibit of Philadelphia photographs by photographer Jerome Lukowicz. So I hope you will come back for all of this, and look forward to seeing more of you. If you're not a member, we hope you'll become a member. We have a lot of options available. Wish you all a good evening. To those who are going to be watching us later on Zoom or on YouTube when this comes up, I hope you enjoy the talk. And thank you again for coming and joining us on your way to your conference. This has been fantastic.